At sunrise, my quiet ranch wasn't quiet anymore. Cars lined the dirt road, tents covered my pasture, and strangers were unloading coolers like they owned the place. Overnight, my land had been turned into a community camping event, approved, promoted, and sold by the HOA president herself. No permission, no warning, just entitlement on full display. By the time I realized nearly 1,000 people were trespassing, it was already out of control. I had two choices: shut it down quietly or expose everything in a way no one could ignore. What happened next changed the neighborhood forever. Before everything unraveled, life on the ranch followed a rhythm that never needed permission slips or approval votes. The land had been in the family for generations, stretching wide under open skies, bordered by fences that existed for safety, not symbolism. Mornings began early, with work that was physical, repetitive, and honest. The days were long, quiet, and predictable in the best way. It was the kind of place where space meant freedom and ownership meant responsibility. For years, the surrounding area had slowly changed. What used to be scattered homes and long gravel drives turned into a polished neighborhood with branded signage, uniform mailboxes, and an HOA that promised community harmony. At first, it barely mattered. The ranch sat just outside the development's neat lines, technically independent, privately owned, and legally separate. There were no shared amenities, no HOA dues, no votes to attend. Just land, livestock, and distance. The HOA leadership, however, saw things differently. As the neighborhood grew, so did its sense of entitlement. The ranch wasn't viewed as a working property anymore. It was seen as unused space, a backdrop, an opportunity. From the outside, it looked empty most of the time. Wide fields, open gates during daylight hours, dirt roads that felt informal compared to paved streets nearby. To some, that openness translated into availability. Small things started to shift. Cars would occasionally pull over near the fence line for photos. Joggers cut across corners of the property instead of staying on marked paths. Trash appeared where it never had before. Each incident was minor on its own, easy to brush off, easy to forgive. After all, the ranch owner wasn't interested in neighborhood politics or pointless disputes. Keeping the peace felt easier than correcting every assumption. Meanwhile, the HOA president had built a reputation. She was highly visible, always speaking in the name of the community, always pushing initiatives that made her look proactive and indispensable. Events, gatherings, fundraisers, all promoted as wins for everyone involved. Her authority wasn't just administrative, it was performative. She liked being seen. She liked being followed. And most of all, she liked making decisions that affected other people. What no one openly discussed was how often those decisions crossed invisible lines. Rules were enforced selectively. Exceptions were made for the right people. And when something sat just outside her official jurisdiction, it was treated less like a boundary and more like a challenge. The ranch, with its size and silence, became a tempting blank canvas. There were hints. Casual mentions in HOA newsletters about outdoor experiences. Social media posts teasing a nature-forward community event. Vague language that avoided specifics while generating excitement. None of it named the ranch directly, but it didn't have to. In a neighborhood where everyone talked, speculation spread quickly. Still, nothing prepared the ranch owner for how far that entitlement would go. No formal requests arrived. No contracts. No conversations. Just assumptions stacking on top of each other until they hardened into action. Somewhere along the line, private property was mentally reclassified as community property, not by law but by audacity. The calm before the storm wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, routine, and deceptively normal. That's what made what came next feel so unreal. One ordinary evening closed with gates latched and animals settled in. Nothing suggested that by morning, control over the land would already be slipping away, not through force, but through arrogance dressed up as leadership. What followed the next few days felt less like a misunderstanding and more like a slow-motion takeover. It started with discovery. Photos began circulating online before the ranch owner even saw the damage in person. Social media posts showed tents pitched across familiar pasture lines, portable fire pits dug into the soil, vehicles parked where livestock usually grazed. Event flyers appeared in neighborhood groups advertising a private community camping experience, complete with a schedule, fees, and a cheerful promise of rustic authenticity. The word private was doing a lot of dishonest work. As more details surfaced, the scope became impossible to ignore. Hundreds of people had already registered. Money had been collected, vendors were listed. Security volunteers were assigned, and every single element traced back to the HOA president's name, her approval, her signature authority. The land was treated like a rentable asset she controlled, not a working ranch owned by someone who had never agreed to any of it. Attempts to slow things down met immediate resistance. Messages went unanswered or were deflected through committee language and procedural delays. Responsibility was blurred. Blame was spread thin enough to feel ungraspable. The HOA framed the event as already in motion, already promised, already too big to cancel without community fallout. The implication was clear. Stopping it would make the ranch owner the villain. Then the pressure escalated. Official-looking notices began arriving, not about the event itself, but about unrelated compliance issues. Fence maintenance warnings, environmental impact concerns, accusations of unsafe conditions visible from neighboring properties. None of them held legal weight over the ranch, but they carried an unmistakable message. Resistance would be punished through nuisance and intimidation. Neighbors started behaving differently too. Some avoided eye contact. Others acted overly friendly, asking questions that felt less curious and more strategic. There was a quiet expectation that the ranch owner would cave for the sake of peace. After all, it was just a weekend, just camping, just a community event. But the reality on the ground told a different story. Increased foot traffic began before the official event date. People crossed fences without asking. Trash accumulated near water sources. Fires were lit in areas never intended for open flames. Each small violation stacked into something dangerous, not just for the land, but for the animals that depended on predictable boundaries and calm environments. The HOA's messaging grew bolder. Promotional posts shifted tone, speaking as if access to the ranch was guaranteed. Phrases like "our land" and "shared space" crept in. The president positioned herself as a visionary, expanding community engagement beyond artificial borders. In doing so, she erased the reality of ownership with remarkable confidence. Behind the scenes, money continued changing hands. Tickets sold out. Deposits were collected. Commitments were made to people who had no idea they were trespassing before they even arrived. The longer it went on, the more cancellation became inconvenient. And inconvenience, in HOA logic, outweighed legality. As the event drew closer, the ranch owner was boxed in. Stopping it outright risked confrontation with hundreds of strangers and the narrative of being unreasonable. Allowing it to proceed meant accepting liability for injuries, damages, and consequences that had never been consented to. Every option came with risk. Every delay worked in the HOA's favor. The morning before the event was the tipping point. Vehicles arrived early. Volunteers set up signage. Temporary barriers were placed that redirected traffic straight through ranch access points. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't accidental. It was a full assertion of control. At that moment, the ranch no longer felt like property. It felt occupied. Anger gave way to something sharper. Determination. The kind that forms when patience has been mistaken for weakness. The ranch owner stopped trying to negotiate through systems designed to stall and started focusing on reality. On boundaries, on consequences, documentation began. Photos, videos, time-stamps, evidence of trespass, evidence of commercialization, evidence of environmental harm. Each piece quietly stored, building a record that told a story no HOA announcement could spin. Still, the event continued to swell. The night before, headlights dotted the horizon. Laughter echoed where there used to be wind and insects. Fires glowed in unauthorized areas. The line between event and disaster blurred with every passing hour. And still, no apology came. No pause, no acknowledgement that a boundary had been crossed. Instead, there was an expectation of silence. Compliance, gratitude even for being included. That assumption became the HOA's greatest mistake. By mid-morning, the ranch had become unrecognizable. What was once open land governed by routine and instinct was now crowded, loud, and unstable. Nearly 900 people occupied space that had never been prepared for human density. The ground was compacted by foot traffic. Temporary structures strained against fences never meant to hold them. The air carried unfamiliar smells, noise, and constant movement. For the animals, it wasn't just disruptive, it was threatening. The HOA president stood at the center of it all, visibly proud. She moved through the crowd as if she owned the success unfolding around her. Every photo taken, every post shared, reinforced her narrative. This was her achievement, her vision realized. The ranch itself had been reduced to a backdrop, stripped of its identity as a working property and reframed as a prop. What she didn't account for was how fragile that illusion really was. Behind the scenes, the ranch owner had stopped reacting and started acting. Evidence had been gathered. Authorities had been notified. Legal documentation had been prepared, outlining trespass, liability exposure, environmental violations, and unauthorized commercial use of private land. The HOA's confidence rested entirely on momentum and spectacle, not law, not consent, and not safety. The turning point arrived when control finally slipped beyond performance. Livestock areas were breached. Children wandered too close to zones clearly marked as restricted. Fires burned closer to dry grass than anyone admitted publicly. The risk was no longer theoretical. It was immediate, and responsibility could no longer be avoided. At that moment, the ranch owner made the decision that ended the fantasy. Access points that had been left open out of patience, not permission, were reclaimed. Natural boundaries were restored. The animals, long accustomed to structure and territory, responded exactly as nature intended. Movement rippled across the land. The crowd's energy shifted instantly from leisure to alarm. Panic spread faster than authority ever could. What the HOA president had sold as rustic charm revealed its reality. This was not a park. This was not a venue. This was a living, working ranch governed by rules no HOA handbook could override. The crowd dispersed in confusion, urgency replacing entitlement as people scrambled to exit a situation they never should have been placed in. And in that chaos, the truth became impossible to ignore. Officials arrived. Documentation was presented. Lines of responsibility were drawn with clarity that social media spin couldn't blur. The HOA president's confidence evaporated as questions turned sharp and unavoidable. Fees collected without permission, events hosted without contracts, land used without consent, liability ignored in favor of optics. What had been framed as leadership now looked like negligence, publicly, undeniably. By the time the land began to breathe again, the power dynamic had permanently shifted. The ranch was no longer a convenient blank space. It was proof that authority without boundaries becomes abuse. Proof that confidence without consent is just entitlement wearing a badge. And as the last vehicles disappeared down the dirt road, one thing was clear. The HOA had gambled everything on the assumption that no one would push back. They were wrong. What followed would make sure they never forgot it. When the dust finally settled, the ranch didn't return to silence right away. Quiet takes time after disruption on that scale. The land bore marks of what had happened: flattened grass, disturbed soil, broken fencing, and the subtle but unmistakable signs of stress that only someone deeply familiar with the property would notice. But unlike the chaos of the event itself, the aftermath moved slowly, deliberately, and with consequences that reached far beyond the pasture. The first shift was official. Investigations didn't drag on or disappear into paperwork because the evidence was impossible to dismiss. The unauthorized event wasn't just a neighborhood overreach. It was a documented case of trespass, commercial misuse of private property, and reckless disregard for safety. The paper trail told a clean, damning story. Money had been collected. Permissions had never been granted. Liability had been ignored. What the HOA had treated as a harmless community gathering was now categorized correctly, a violation with legal and financial weight. The HOA president's public presence vanished almost overnight. Social media posts stopped. Community updates went silent. The confident tone that once framed every decision evaporated, replaced by formal statements written in careful, defensive language. Meetings that were once filled with enthusiasm became tense and sparsely attended. Neighbors who had previously followed without question began asking the kind of inquiries that don't come from curiosity, but from concern. Insurance companies got involved. Vendors demanded explanations. Attendees requested refunds. And suddenly, the successful event narrative collapsed under the pressure of accountability. The same momentum that had been used to justify ignoring boundaries now worked in reverse, accelerating the consequences. Within weeks, leadership changes followed. The HOA president didn't step down in a dramatic announcement. She faded out, edged aside by policy reviews, internal votes, and quiet resignations that spoke louder than any confrontation ever could. Her authority hadn't been stripped by anger or revenge, but by exposure. Once her actions were placed in full context, they were indefensible. The HOA itself didn't dissolve, but it changed. New restrictions were put in place. Jurisdiction boundaries were clarified in writing. Decision-making authority was limited, documented, and reviewed. The neighborhood learned painfully that governance without restraint doesn't protect a community, it fractures it. For the ranch owner, the outcome was more than legal vindication. It was a reclaiming of control that went deeper than fences or paperwork. Clear boundaries were reinforced. Gates that had once been left open out of trust were now secured out of wisdom. Signage was installed, not as an act of hostility, but as a reminder that respect starts with clarity. There was no celebration, no victory lap, just a quiet satisfaction that comes from standing firm when silence would have been easier. The land gradually returned to its rhythm. Animals settled back into predictable patterns. The open sky reclaimed its dominance over artificial noise. What had been disrupted was restored, not through force, but through resolve. The neighborhood, meanwhile, was forced to reflect. Some residents felt embarrassed, others felt complicit. Many realized for the first time how easily authority can be abused when it's wrapped in friendly language and good intentions. The idea that community automatically justifies access was questioned, openly, sometimes uncomfortably. Conversations changed. People asked before assuming. They thought twice before sharing space that didn't belong to them. The ranch, once viewed as unused or available, was now understood as something else entirely. Private, purposeful, and deserving of respect. What lingered most wasn't anger, it was awareness. The event became a cautionary tale, not just about HOAs, but about power dynamics everywhere, about how confidence can masquerade as competence, about how popularity can drown out legality if no one challenges it, and about how boundaries, when left undefended, eventually meet resistance. The ranch owner never sought revenge. The decision to act wasn't about humiliation or dominance. It was about drawing a line when every polite signal had been ignored, about reminding people that private property isn't theoretical. It's real, it carries responsibility, risk, and rights that don't disappear just because someone with a title wants them to. Years later, the story still circulates, not as gossip, but as a reminder. New HOA members are told what happened. Policies reference it indirectly. The ranch stands unchanged, but its presence feels different now. Not vulnerable, not overlooked, simply acknowledged, and that acknowledgement matters. Because the real resolution wasn't the fines or the resignations or the legal fallout. It was the restoration of balance. The understanding that community only works when consent exists. That leadership without humility becomes dangerous. And that silence, when mistaken for permission, eventually meets resistance. The land didn't need to shout to make its point. It just needed its owner to stop stepping aside. In the end, the question isn't whether the HOA went too far. It's how often people do, and how rarely anyone is willing to say, "This stops here."